Yeah, and here we go. First, people are logging on, our participants. They're coming in quickly today. That's great.
That's what we want to see. No dawdlers here.
Exactly. Still logging on. We still have a few minutes to start. We'll still give it a minute. Yep, more people are coming in. That's great. Everybody has the right link. That is awesome. And we can also see people joining our YouTube channel for the ones that prefer that over Zoom. All right. Well, I guess I have more people logging on, but I guess we're right at the hour here. And should we get started?
Sure.
Yeah. So welcome. Welcome to the Great Decisions Speaker Series and today's event, Russia and the United States. The Great Decisions Speaker Series is an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association. It is sponsored locally by the World Affairs Council St. Louis chapter and UMSL Global, which is the international office at the University of Missouri St. Louis. My name is Liane Constantine. I'm the Executive Director of UMSL Global, as well as I am a board member of the World Affairs Council. UMSL Global has been a partner and a sponsor of the speaker series for very many years. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. A few remarks on the tradition of the series. Great Decisions is an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association, and the first Great Decisions group was launched in Portland, Oregon as early as 1954. It was based on a face-to-face model facilitating active and informal conversation. Meanwhile, Great Decisions has developed into the largest US-based discussion program about foreign policy. That's pretty amazing. And it provides an opportunity for US audiences to learn about and to understand the complex foreign policy issues of our time and to understand the essentials of a democratic society. And I think democracy will be discussed today in depth. As many of our frequent followers know, the World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with local chapters across the United States. We are a membership-based organization that connects each local chapter with the world. Founded in 1948, its mission is to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership of world affairs. The team here, that is our hosting team, our World Affairs team, will put the membership link into our chat box for everyone. And for everyone interested in learning more about becoming a member or considering joining us, AMSL students, if you're on the call, our office will assist you exploring World Affairs memberships further if you are interested. So back to the mission and the objectives of our Great Decision Speaker Series, providing a space for discussing international topics is very important. It's more important than at any point of time, I would claim. And I just wanted to extend a great level of thank you and gratitude to our very active, creative, and ambitious membership base. Many speakers volunteer their time and their knowledge to us. And so do moderators and the fleet of volunteers helping us identifying the best speakers for our topics. So kudos to everybody. Before I finally introduce our speaker to you today, let me give you the heads up for our technical setup. This webinar will be recorded and you will be able to find the recording on our AMSL Global Events website afterwards. You'll find that link in the chat box as well. For questions, please use our Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. I'm sorry. At any time of the presentation, whenever your questions pop up, and we will relay those questions to our speaker today. The presentation will take about 30 minutes and we will have plenty of opportunity and time to engage in a discussion with our speaker, who I'd like to introduce now. Dr. Ellen Carnagan is a professor of political science at St. Louis University, SLU. She studies Russian and comparative politics with a particular focus on the roles of citizens play in political change. She received her undergraduate degree from Brown University in Rhode Island, followed by a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and her PhD from NYU. Dr. Carnagan recently edited a book, Power and Protest at an American University, No Confidence, No Fear, that collects research that examines St. Louis University's 2012 and 13 No Confidence movement from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. An earlier book, and here it becomes more interesting for the topic of today, if I may say so, an earlier book, Out of Order, Russian Political Values in an Imperfect World, explores how political values of Russian citizens have been shaped the disorderly conditions produced by the political and economic transformations that followed the collapse of communism. That book was based on extensive fieldwork in Russia. Can't wait to hear more about that. And interviews with ordinary citizens between the years of 1998 and 2003. A Russian language version will be out of Out of Order is scheduled for this year. And your book is definitely on my reading list, Professor Carnagan. So Professor Carnagan is presently working on projects related to the survival of opposition movements in authoritarian regimes, focusing particularly on the Putin regime in Russia. Her articles have appeared in Comparative Politics, Democratization, Europe-Asia Studies, Political Science and Politics, Slavic Review, and Post-Soviet Affairs. So Russia and the US is the topic of our event today. And with no further delay, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Carnagan.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to focus my talk today on war in Ukraine. I think war in Ukraine is narrower than our assigned topic of Russia and the US, but it is the most pertinent and pressing entry into the topic about the Russia and the US. As Leanne said, I plan to talk for about half an hour. If you want to move beyond the issues of Ukraine in the question and answer period, that's fine with me. We can do that. So I want to focus my comments today around the question, what could Putin be thinking? And I mean this really in a number of different sentences. For one thing, I'm interested in the narratives that he has used to justify his actions in Ukraine. And I want to compare those narratives with what other people might think about what he's talking about. I also want to talk about what he may have expected in terms of a response, both from the Ukrainians and from the West, versus the reality of that response. And then finally, and somewhat speculatively, I want to talk a little bit about what he could be thinking about accomplishing here, what his ultimate outcome could be. And I also mean to capture in this question, what could Putin be thinking? The sort of sense like, what could he be thinking? What could justify in his head this violation of international law, a violation of all kinds of norms of civilized behavior, attacking his neighbor? So there is, of course, some danger in this approach that I am taking. Who am I to get inside the head of a dictator? We can see Putin's behavior. We can listen to what he chooses to say, although we may not always believe that he's telling us the truth, but we can't get inside his head. So we don't really know what he's thinking. And in some ways, the inner workings of the brain of a dictator is foreign to me. I don't think that way. I've never felt like I wanted to invade my neighbor. So this is necessarily somewhat speculative, and it gets more speculative towards the end. And there may well be other explanations for Putin's behavior that we can talk about again in the question and answer. So to start, here's Ukraine, and I can, I think, show you on my cursor, Ukraine right here, there. It says, or I've read, that Ukraine is the second largest country by area in Europe after Russia. This map makes Sweden and Finland look considerably larger than Ukraine, but I think that might just be the nature of the projection. Ukraine's also eighth in population in Europe with 41 million people. So we're talking about a large country here when we talk about Ukraine. And you can see that it is surrounded on many sides here by Russia, and then also by some countries that formerly had been part of the Soviet satellites or parts of the Soviet Union, starting with Belarus and going up. I have a couple of maps coming up that don't have these borders on it, so I just want to make sure you're kind of oriented to where Ukraine is. This little peninsula down here in the Black Sea is Crimea, and then Ukraine is above it, going off in both directions. It's the Sea of Azov over there. Okay, so Putin has claimed that he's justified in attacking Ukraine because Ukraine's not really a separate country from Russia. So he has said, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our history, culture, and spiritual space. Thinking there are is the Russians. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. And the root of this claim, the part of this claim that is reasonable to make, is that both Ukraine and Russia draw their claim of nationhood from the same space, referred to as Kievan Rus. So it was really centered around Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, but it extended up into the area that is Russia. So Kiev's down here, and then Russia would be most of this area over there. So Kievan Rus was really a confederation of different units, existed between the 9th and the 13th century. It is the political unit that where the introduction to Eastern Orthodox Christianity occurred. And so it is the sort of root source of nationhood for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Kievan Rus was a federation. Federations are prone to falling apart, and this one did fall apart. And part of the pressure of it falling apart was the invasion of Mongols over here, the Golden Horde. So that's under that impulse, this political organization of Kievan Rus fell apart. The U.S. Embassy in Kiev recently posted this tweet indicating that at this point of Kievan Rus, Kiev was a well-developed city, and Moscow really wasn't developed at all. Moscow develops later. Moscow is the place in Russia from which Russia starts to throw off the Golden Horde, the Mongols. And so here, this green spot is Muscovy, so the area around Moscow. And that was the first area that stopped paying the taxes to the Mongols and claimed their independence. And then from that spot, Russia gradually expanded first into the yellow area, then into the orange area, and then into the purple area. And as you can see, this is Ukraine down here again, near the Black Sea. So parts of Ukraine were incorporated into the Russian Empire at various points. And I have another map here that's just a little bit clearer as to the times. So once again, Ukraine down here, and some of the northern parts incorporated relatively early, but most of it incorporated at one point in around the 18th century. And then some parts, especially the parts farthest to the west, weren't incorporated into the Soviet Union until before or after World War II. So what is present day Ukraine? Had been parts of various empires. Some parts of it were part of the Russian Empire. Some parts of it were part of Poland. Some parts at various points in time were ruled by Lithuania. And some parts were also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Nonetheless, and back to Putin's claim that this isn't really a separate country, Ukrainian culture and language have existed for centuries. There was a Ukrainian nationalist movement that arose in the mid-1800s. I've got some key figures here. So there's publication of significant literature in Ukrainian. Sense of a different culture had always been present. And of course, empires don't tend to homogenize their whole regions. They allow various spots to continue to develop the way they were. Empires don't actually want everybody to unite with each other, so division is better. So Ukraine was recognized as an independent space, not independent, but as a space that had its own culture and language for quite a bit of time. After World War I, when all of these empires collapse, Ukraine was briefly independent. It's not a very big claim to independence, but that's true for much of this region of the world. Part of Ukraine was incorporated into the Soviet Union, so that's this green spot here on this map, by force at the end of the Civil War in 1922. And then other parts were only incorporated somewhat after 1922. So the western part over here, either before or after World War II. And then Crimea, the little peninsula down here in the Black Sea, incorporated only in 1954, supposedly when Khrushchev was drunk and just gave it away at a point when it really didn't matter whether it was part of Russia or Ukraine, because the Soviet Union was so tightly controlled from the center that the actual ownership of Crimea was fairly insignificant. In 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, there was a referendum in Ukraine at that time. As my slide said, 84% of Ukrainians went to the polls, and more than 90% cast ballots in favor of independence. So there was a strong feeling at that point, as there had been earlier, that Ukraine was a separate country, not part of Russia, and belonged by itself as its own country. So Putin may say that Ukraine is not a real country, but Ukrainians don't agree with that, and history really doesn't agree with it either. This slide shows the ethnic composition of Ukraine, and that is to say how people identify themselves, whether as ethnic Ukrainians or ethnic Russians. And I think it's interesting to notice that practically everybody identifies themselves as ethnic Ukrainians, with a couple of exceptions. So this area over here in the far east is one area that has been contested since 2014. And then this is the Crimea down here, which had a whole bunch of Russians living in it, partly because it only became part of Ukraine in 1954, and also partly because there's a Russian naval base there for the Black Sea fleet. And also because it's a really nice place with beaches and palm trees, and so it's a place people want to go. Okay, so most people identify as ethnic Ukrainian. It is interesting to note, though, that there is more Russian language speaking than you might anticipate for all of those ethnic Ukrainians. And that is to say, a lot of people who identify as ethnic Ukrainian are either bilingual or in fact have Russian as their first language. And there's a very clear regional difference here that you can see on the slide. So that here in the eastern part is where we have primarily Russian speakers. And then in the west and central part, we have primarily Ukrainian speakers. It had been the custom in Ukraine that many people were bilingual, and if someone spoke to you in one language, then that would be the language that you would reply in. So it was a very polite kind of treatment of a multilingual situation. Okay, so the other thing that Putin has claimed is that this present Ukrainian government is illegitimate, having come into power as a result of a coup. So he says radical nationalists took advantage of the justified political discontent and saddled the Maidan protest, escalating it to a coup d'etat in 2014. They also had direct assistance from foreign states. According to reports, the U.S. Embassy provided $1 million a day to support the so-called protest camp on Independence Square in Kiev. I will say the only such reports of that level of support from the United States is our Russian news sources. That is, Russian news sources say that's what we've done, but nobody else does. The United States has, over time, supported opposition groups in Ukraine, so that's not completely a fabrication, but the size of that and the implication that that's the only reason those people came into power is also false. Putin's reference here is to the Euromaidan, or Revolution of Dignity, which occurred over the winter 2013-2014. At this event, what happened was Viktor Yanukovych, who was president of Ukraine and favored Russia, he was from that eastern part, he was himself a Russian speaker, had been moving towards a trade agreement with the European Union. And most Ukrainians seem to support that movement toward the European Union. At the last minute, Yanukovych backed down and signed an agreement with Russia instead, and also got an influx of cash as a result. So protests started to occur, and they were at first peaceful protests, and they were at first about this issue of European integration. They started to shift kind of quickly into also complaints about government corruption. There has been a lot of trouble with corruption in Ukraine, and Yanukovych personally was understood and now is known to have greatly profited from his time in office. The government responded to these peaceful protests by shooting the protesters. Many people who previously had not been protesting were appalled at that. And so there was a big movement of people into Independence Square in Kiev, and a lot of support, and the demonstrators organized themselves to fight back. Their weapon of choice, or maybe just because it's the one they could produce on short notice, was the Molotov cocktail, and so there was a fair amount of fire as a result. This went on for a couple of months with demonstrators camped out in the center of the city and the government not being really able to dislodge them. And then finally, Viktor Yanukovych, the president, fled Ukraine as it appeared that his security forces were also fleeing. And so there was nobody there who was going to support him. Shortly after Yanukovych fled, we start to see Russians taking over pieces of Ukraine in response. So first, Crimea. the peninsula that I've pointed out a couple of times now. And then we've also seen Russian-backed insurgents in both Luhansk and Donetsk, an area sometimes also referred to as the Donbass because it's the basin of the Don River. That started right after the Euromaidan and has continued up until this intensification that we have seen over the past couple of weeks. When I say Russian forces, it was at first somewhat obscure who these people were. They were not wearing their Russian army insignia, although it has become pretty clear over time who they are. So Putin has also claimed, and then here largely about these Far East areas, that these people in eastern Ukraine have been under attack by this illegitimate Ukrainian government that's made up of Nazi sympathizers. So he says that his goal is the defense of people who for a period of 8 years have suffered the scorn and genocide of the Kiev regime. And for that, we strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine and bring to justice those who have carried out many bloody crimes against peaceful citizens, including citizens of the Russian Federation. This is basically a fantasy. That is to say, there's not any evidence I know of, well, certainly not of genocide, but really not even of bloody crimes against peaceful citizens. There has been an ongoing conflict. Both sides are armed, and no doubt some citizens have suffered as a result of that. There is this really small kernel of truth about the denazification element, but it's tiny. And that is to say that during the Euromaidan, there were some neo-Nazi groups that were involved. Basically, these were tough guys looking for a fight, and there was a fight to be had at the Euromaidan. But it's not a feature of the government presently. Of course, the president at that moment is Jewish. The Ukrainian government did in 2014 pass a law that would make Ukrainian the sole state language at all levels, including in regions where Russian speakers predominated. The law was rescinded relatively quickly. It actually never came into effect, but the damage was done. And so that's the root of this claim, which otherwise is a serious exaggeration of what the problem is. So we might ask, why does Putin care about Ukraine? What is his interest here? So I'll give you a couple of suggestions, but here I am trying to get inside his head in ways that I may not quite succeed. Arguably, parts of Ukraine have some strategic value, especially the Crimea, since, as you can see, this is Russia. Oh, sorry. This is Russia over here. Russia doesn't have a whole lot of rivers that run south. Most of Russia's rivers run north into areas that are frozen in the winter. This one runs south, but it goes into the Sea of Azov, which you can't get through if Crimea is controlled by the Ukrainians. And then, of course, this whole area on the northern edge of the Sea of Azov could also be argued to have some strategic value. So really, this area here could be argued to have some strategic value for Russia. Although the Ukrainians have not generally been hostile to Russia. I think the Ukrainian people are not hostile to Russian people. And there have been certain points where the two governments have been sufficiently at loggerheads that one could imagine trade being cut off or ship access being cut off. But in general, that wouldn't be an issue, except, of course, if you're going to attack a country, then it becomes one. So some strategic value because of Ukraine's placement on the Black Sea. That's one thing that Putin could be interested in. Another thing that he's clearly interested in is he wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO. And again, this is Ukraine over here. You can see the Crimea. At a point in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when Russia was still recovering from the very difficult transition from a planned economy to a market economy and all the political transitions that came along with that, NATO's borders expanded. Okay, so NATO welcomed first members that had been satellite countries of the Soviet Union, and that is to say they had been occupied at the end of World War II, and after World War II remained part of the Warsaw Pact, so part of a military alliance with the Soviet Union, and they traded a great deal with the Soviet Union. They were technically independent, but not able to come up with their own foreign policies or even their own domestic policies. And then in 2004, there was a second expansion, which took in not only some countries in former satellite countries that had been a little bit slower to meet the criteria that NATO had set, but also Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were parts of the Soviet Union. They had only been part of the Soviet Union since the end of World War II. Prior to that, they had not been, but nonetheless, they were part of the Soviet Union. And so Putin sees the expansion of NATO to encompass countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union as an expansion into what he sees as Russia's sphere of influence. And it is pretty clear that he hopes to draw the line at Ukraine. Even the kind of conflict that has existed since 2014 with armed conflict in a small region of Ukraine is generally quite enough to keep a country out of NATO. You have to not have any of those kinds of conflicts if you're going to make it into NATO. So that doesn't entirely explain why he needs to invade the whole country. But nonetheless, he clearly wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO. Now, the other thing that happened at roughly the same time was an expansion of the European Union. And here again, it has encompassed pretty much all of the same countries. And this again is Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia up here, the Baltics. And they became members of the European Union in 2004. I think it's also the case that, and in some cases, it might even be a bit more serious in Putin's mind that he doesn't want Ukraine to be part of the European Union. Putin presents himself as the defender of traditional conservative values in the face of the corruption of liberal and democratic values. So he sees himself as a defender of autocracy against those wild and crazy ideas of democracy. And of course, to be a member of the European Union, you have to meet certain democratic standards. So were Ukraine to join the European Union, it would indicate that it had met those democratic standards. And then were it to become a prosperous country as a result of joining the European Union, it would be a really bad model in Putin's mind for an alternative to everything that he's trying to do in Russia, which is to do away with democracy, what little existed at the time he came into power, and also take a fair amount of state control over the economy. So as part of this overall hostility to democracy, we have seen a number of other kinds of action on the part of the Russian government. They're trying to use disinformation and the cultivation of extremist groups to encourage divisions within democratic societies, and also to encourage discontent with democratic institutions. It's widely assumed that Russians have infiltrated, of course, the US election in 2016, probably also in 2020 to some degree, and also the Brexit vote in Britain. So that is efforts to divide up peoples within democratic systems in the hope of weakening them overall. So Putin doesn't want to see democracy survive in the world, and Ukraine is one of the places he really doesn't want to see that happen. Okay, so the last part of my talk here is trying to assess what Putin was thinking when he decided that he wanted to invade his neighbor, Ukraine. It does seem as though he expected this to be a quick and easy kind of invasion, and it may still be comparatively easy for him, but it's not been as easy as he anticipated. He did not expect the kind of resistance that he got from Ukraine. And I don't think he expected the kind of coordinated response that he has gotten from the West. So what I have up here on the screen now is the results of the 2010 presidential election. And the 2010 election was the one that put Yanukovych in power, and he was the guy we were talking about earlier who left the country during the Euromaidan. And he was a pro-Russian candidate. And what you can see on this slide is that the political party preferences in Ukraine are very regionally divided. So over here on the east, you have parties that tend to vote on a pro-Russian kind of slant. And then over here on the west and also sort of in the center, you've got, but much more intensely in the west, you've got parties that are on a more European centered approach. And a lot of elections since the end of communism in Ukraine have divided pretty much this way. And so in that sense, Putin might have thought, well, there's a whole bunch of people, almost 50% of the population, who are relatively open to the fact that they can be called Russians, and they want to have closer relation to Russians. So maybe this would make it not so difficult. The thing that's interesting here, I think, is the most recent presidential election, the one that put Volodymyr Zelensky in power, and that's he used the green here on the map. And as you can see, he has a fair amount of support all across Ukraine, not only in the usually pro-Russian east, but also in the usually not pro-Russian west. So in that sense, Putin may have overestimated the number of Ukrainians who would be open to the idea of some kind of closer connection or domination by Russia. Zelensky himself, I think, has also been a surprise, not only to Putin, but maybe to Ukrainians as well. His major qualification for the role of president was that he had played a president on TV. And he has not necessarily been seen as the most forceful and effective president up until this point. But with the Russian invasion, he has stayed in the country. You can now buy T-shirts that have his famous quote there, "I need ammunition, not a ride," in response to the United States offer to remove him from Ukraine. So he's stayed. He's shown that he is on the streets. He has, informally been talking to the Ukrainians on a frequent basis, and he has, as a result, been really effective at rallying Ukrainians to defend their country in a way that probably Putin did not expect. I would say Putin probably also did not expect the West to be capable of a unified response. I think the view that Putin has of the West is one that's very divided, so that the European Union has all kinds of diverse interests. I think Putin was counting on the fact that Germany gets a lot of natural gas from Russia to affect how Germany would vote, and obviously Britain is no longer part of the European Union. Under President Trump, there was a fair amount of criticism of NATO, so that I don't know that Putin thought that NATO could act as a unified body as a result. And then the divisions within American politics as well would cast doubt on the ability of the United States to respond. And then the withdrawal from Afghanistan also indicates that the United States is not much interested in another international adventure at this point. So I suspect that Putin anticipated a more restrained kind of response from the West and has probably been surprised by the response that he has gotten, but so far it has not stopped him. So I'm going to close with these questions because this is getting into the what are Putin's ultimate goals question. And here we can only guess exactly what he is looking to do. So one question, and I think this is probably the biggest question for a lot of people, is Ukraine enough for Putin? Putin is known to have said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster. So how much of the Soviet Union might he be thinking that it is possible to reconnect to Russia? He doesn't have that many other countries left before he starts to run into NATO members. Okay, so that's Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, those three little countries up on the Baltic Sea. And so that's what I'm getting at with my second question there. Does Putin have his eye on that Western alliance? I wonder whether Putin is thinking to himself, okay, well, I will call NATO's bluff. I will invade a NATO member, which obligates all members of NATO to come to the defense of that country, and see if they do. Because if they don't, it means that NATO is dead, and there is no Western alliance, and Putin can do pretty much whatever he wants to do. But that means that all the NATO members have to ask themselves, is it really worth it to risk World War III? Nuclear war for the defense of Estonia, 1.5 million population, used to be part of the Soviet Union. So if that's how Putin is thinking, then he may be thinking, can he actually destroy the Western alliance because people are not willing to defend countries that are now members of NATO that are also on Russia's border. And then the last question that I think Putin might be asking himself as well is, so what happens inside Russia at this point? Is it possible that the Putin regime has actually gone too far? Russian population has no great stomach for war with Ukraine. They have friends and neighbors and relatives who live in Ukraine. So the longer this goes on, the harder it is on that level. Now, the Russian population don't have much power over the political system, but the people who do have power over the political system are the security forces, the Siloviki, as they're called, and they are the folks who keep Putin in place, and they are also the folks who are having trouble supplying their troops as they are invading Ukraine and are watching some of those troops, in fact, lay down their arms and say, nobody told me that I was coming here to invade Ukraine, and I just won't do it. So those are the people I'd watch moving forward, because those are the people who hold up the regime in its present form and could decide not to. Other than that, I think what we're looking at is greater repression within Russia itself, so that it's not only the Ukrainian people who will be likely to suffer from this action, but probably the Russian people as well. And with that, I will stop, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Carnagan. The last slide here in particular is mind-boggling, but I leave that to our audience to maybe dive deeper into more questions if they had them. I wanted to thank you first for this 360 of Ukrainian-Russian history, that we are all on a good starting basis here for big picture that we need to have. And I have a few questions that were pre-submitted, but I'd like to keep those for later and start with the ones that are actually in our Q&A right now. The first question that I have here for you is, what are your thoughts on Russia joining NATO in 2000? Why and what changed their mind?
I don't think there was really serious consideration that Russia would join NATO in 2000. I don't think Russia wanted to be constrained by NATO, but I'm also not sure that NATO felt that Russia at that point was a particularly good bet. 2000 was a tricky time in Russia. If we think back to it, 2000 is when Putin comes into power. And of course, when he came into power, he came in by a semi-democratic kind of way. That is to say, Yeltsin had been elected president in elections that may not have been fair, but nonetheless had been elected president. And then he decided that he would resign and put Putin temporarily in charge. And then Putin was elected president in March of 2000. So he was a new president and also engaged in a new second war in Chechnya that he wanted to successfully prosecute, which could have been limited by any kind of NATO membership.
That's right. And as I remember, Professor Carnegie, I mean, Putin, especially from the East, from the European countries, he was really welcomed as somebody who speaks fluent German and other European languages. He served in official capacities in Europe, across Europe before, and wasn't the Putin he has developed or morphed into these days.
Right. Right. When Putin took power, I have to say I liked him. I thought he was great because in the comparison there, and it's a comparison that many Russian people also have in their minds, it's a comparison with Yeltsin. And Yeltsin had led the country into economic collapse. This may not have been his fault. There may not have been a better way to go from a planned economy to a market economy, but that's what Russians saw on a daily basis, that he had caused this economic severe dislocation, inflation, loss of savings, all that kind of thing. And Putin, in comparison, seemed to be more in control, able to solve some of these issues. And indeed, the economy started to improve once he was in office, though probably not because he was in office, but because it takes some time for economies to get to the point where they start improving. But it is one source of his, was an early source of his popularity that hasn't entirely gone away.
Right, right. So the next question that came in takes us a little bit to one of your slides that we saw before about his support in Russia itself. So the question is, are there any recent reliable figures on how strong Putin's support is within Russia? Are there any dissident groups that could possibly enact government change?
Okay, so that's a big question. Mm-hmm. Over the past, well, let's say 10 years at least, Putin has seriously cracked down on any opposition groups. So there used to be a number of opposition groups. They didn't have a whole lot of power or even support from the population, but they existed. They were there. They were in Russia. And then they were able to articulate opposition arguments that people might see. The Russian press has been largely controlled by the state, again, since about 2007. But it has been possible for people to get around the state-controlled press. They do tend to have fairly open access to the internet, so that's one way. And there have been some independent publications, either newspapers, also radio station and a TV station, which have recently been closed down. But those voices have effectively all been silenced. So what Russian people hear, unless they really work at it to go outside and around the press that's all around them, is the argument that defends the state. That which Putin wants them to hear. I think, getting back to the beginning of your question, in that kind of a circumstance, I'm not sure there really is such a thing as a reliable public opinion poll, because what public opinion is then is what was manufactured by the state. And that is not to say that people necessarily believe all this stuff, but that they don't have the other information. And so it's not that they have a very strong feeling towards this stuff that they have heard from the state, but it is the only explanation that they have. There was a recent poll that was done in Russia that indicated some support for invasion of Ukraine, but the question that was asked in that poll was whether it was whether people would support, whether Russians would support a limited military action in order to stop the creation of a NATO base in Ukraine, and also to fight fascists. Russians generally are willing to fight fascists because they were invaded by Nazi Germany during World War II. And that poll, given its wording, did have majority support among the population. Other polls that have been done further in the past, not exactly at this moment, asking about enthusiasm for a war with Ukraine, got about 6% of the population saying that they would like such a thing. I think my sense is that this is a case that the more Russians understand what is actually happening in Ukraine, the less likely they are to support it. Russians and Ukrainians may be separate nations, but they are rather close nations. The closest comparison I can come to is that it would be like if the United States invaded Canada. And I think most Americans would first start by saying, why would you invade Canada? But then secondly would start with, but I know people from Canada. I've been to Canada. I go back and forth to Canada. And that's true for Russians and Ukrainians. That is there's a lot of interconnections. Probably it's hard to find a Russian, especially a Russian in an urban area, who doesn't know some Ukrainian people, maybe even has some Ukrainian relatives. And so that certainly sustained war with Ukraine would be hard to convince Russians that they were in favor of.
That's a great comparison, Professor Carnigan, like with the US and Canada here. Also, I liked your slides that covered the languages spoken in which parts of the Ukraine versus ethnic distribution. And so it actually shows that, like it says, I think your green slide was like, everybody feels Ukrainian, while they might have Russian as a first language. And on a personal note, so of course, everybody who's connected somehow and has friends or relatives in that area. So a friend of mine is Russian, lives here in St. Louis, and I checked in with her because I know that she was actually raised in Kiev, and I asked her if her family was safe, and she said, no, they're all in bunkers in south of Kiev right now. And so when I asked her, well, they're ethnic Russians, can they not get out? And the brief answer was, but they feel Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. And it's too late to get out. So there's that part too, and that was really impressive. And today, your slides to that really illustrated the facts to to that statement and shed light on that. But I'll go to the next question here, since we have really interesting questions coming in from our audience. Next one is, how has Putin cultivated white supremacist groups?
Okay, so mostly through social media. By masquerading as an American and saying, well, I have these kinds of ideas, and aren't I like you? And then trying to push groups sometimes push groups in a more radical direction. And there's a fair amount of evidence that there's a fair amount of evidence that Russians are doing this, and there's not much doubt that Russians don't do things that Putin doesn't know about.
Right. So the next one is submitted by my friend Terry Hatfield, who is also in the World Affairs Council, and it's an interesting question. What are your thoughts on a potential change in Putin's mental state?
So that's a good question. So there has been some evidence over the past couple years that is as a result of the coronavirus, actually, that Putin has secluded himself away and has not been taking as active a daily role in governance. So I think there is some doubt about exactly what his mental state is. I will also note he's been in power now for 22 years. 22 years is way too long for an individual to wield as much power as Putin does. I am fairly confident that he has gotten to the point where he doesn't listen to the people around him, and he has decided for himself what the world is. And he is not really open to other information. And then he has the power to just tell people do things, and they do them. And I'm afraid that's the situation that we were in. I was talking to a student of mine last night who asked, were you surprised that we actually see this invasion of Ukraine? And I turned the question around and asked him if he was surprised, and he said, well, yeah, he was. He thought that we were dealing with a rational actor. And Putin doesn't seem like a rational actor at the moment. And that's why I phrased this question, what is he thinking? Because it doesn't seem rational to invade a not harmful neighbor and to get the results and the sanctions that he has in response. And so it's tough. You'd like to think you're dealing with a rational actor, and I am not so sure. So Leanne said earlier in the introduction that she thought that my book about the no confidence movement at SLU was different, but autocrats are autocrats, right? and the opposition to autocrats is tough in all circumstances. So that's the problem that we're dealing with here, autocrats.
Absolutely. And actually, I have a pre-submitted question here that I'll fill in quickly. It asks, the question is, how much is this a conflict of systems rather than a conflict of regional interest? And I think that is a dotted line to the question of autocracy.
Yeah. So I think it is ultimately a question about systems. And I think certainly in Putin's mind, it is a question about systems. That is, we on the United States side might see it primarily as this issue about who is controlling Ukraine, without feeling like it is a world system of more democratic states versus a small but not insignificant system of autocratic states. Autocracy actually has been on the rise over the past couple of years. And so when I say small, I was thinking about the 5 states that voted against Putin in the UN the other day. But there are a lot of autocracies in the world, and democracies that we may have thought were very stable, including our own, have slid down the democratic rankings. That political scientists make those kind of rankings. And so I think we are in a battle to defend the principle of democracy and the institutions that have supported it, including NATO and the European Union. And if we give up on them, then we will probably be looking at more autocratic countries and a more hostile world for democratic ones.
Well, I have to take this in, but I'll hop to the next question. So, next question is, what is the latest on the domestic unrest in Russia? Are the protests growing or diminishing in recent days in size and strength? So that's asking, I think, to like, what's the Russian base doing?
Okay, so people have been going to demonstrations protesting war. So they're really anti-war demonstrations, not particularly anti-Putin demonstrations, although there may be some overlap there in sentiments. And the latest I heard was that 7,000 people have been arrested at these protests, which is to say that many more people have been present at these protests. I think it is hard to tell, and I actually cannot hazard a guess about whether people will protest in larger numbers or whether the protests will die down. That is to say, this is a government that's willing to arrest its own citizens and for speaking their minds. And if that's true, it means that people are making a decision to, when they leave the house, to say, I'm going to this protest. The decision is, I am willing to get arrested, because that is a likely outcome. And that's a hard decision for people, especially for people who really are living in this media bubble where they don't have complete information about what's happening. So I think it could occur in the future that these protests just die down. It could also occur that they increase, especially since people are feeling the economic pain of sanctions. So it's not just whether they care about the Ukrainians, but also a question about what Putin is doing to them personally.
What can maybe a follow-up question on that one, because I had a couple of pre-submitted questions in the same area asking for how basically the Russian population would be responding. How can we, meaning I guess the West, help support strengthening this base?
The base of the Russian people?
Yeah.
So that's a tough one. And that is to say, one of the tools that Putin uses to discredit those who would oppose him is that they receive aid from the West. You saw that in my slide where he was talking about the Euromaidan as being just funded by the United States. He uses that trope all the time, that they're just funded by the United States, and therefore it's really the US here who is opposing me, as opposed to ordinary Russians. So that actually does limit what the West can do to help Russians, because they, the sort of the easy thing, providing money or other kinds of assistance, may not help very much. I think one thing the West can do is to notice that people are being arrested and to make statements about the fact that all of these people are being arrested and they should be released, and to continue with economic sanctions until maybe we see some kind of change in Putin's behavior. I think the other thing that we can do actually is to try to overcome some of our own problems. That is to say, to the degree that Putin is looking at polarization in the United States and seeing it as a source of weakness, which it is, then that's something we can do. It may not help the Russians immediately, but it will help us defend democratic values in the world. If we do it at home.
What I liked in one of your slides and your comments was to really remind everybody to differentiate between politics and the people. And I guess personally, I feel as a European here, I count on the literacy of Russians, reading and speaking multiple languages and having access to different media other than just Russian media. So as long as it is not totally shut off, of course, Russia is very strong in controlling that space for sure. But I will jump over to the next question. It is a little bit longer. What are your thoughts about Russia's invasion within the context that Putin's strategy of illiberalism was strengthening in Poland and Hungary? Also, the cult of white Christian nationalism that has gained political support not only in the former Warsaw satellites, but in Britain, France, and even in America. Is Putin's military action counter to the strengthening support? So that's a very big question here.
Okay. So I think that's an interesting question, because in some ways the move away from liberal democracy in both Poland and Hungary was another solution to the NATO problem of Ukraine. And that is to say, NATO only admits members if 100% of the NATO members agree that they should have this new member. So if Poland and Hungary were friendly enough to the ideas that Putin has about Ukraine not being a member of NATO, then Ukraine would never be a member of NATO. That would be a solution. You wouldn't need to invade. The problem, though, with those countries is, of course, they've experienced Russian invasion themselves. And while they might see, some interest in moving away from liberal democracy, they don't necessarily want to move back into the Soviet sphere. So I was very interested. Yesterday, I got an email from, I think from a librarian actually, but it was from, came originally from the Polish Academy of Sciences. And the Polish Academy of Sciences is offering all Ukrainian scholars that they will pay their transit fee, whatever it costs to get them to Poland, and then they will employ them for at least 3 months with a possibility of extension, since we don't know how all of this is going to work out. And that is to say, the Polish Academy of Sciences is working directly against any idea that the Polish government might want to be on the same side as Putin. And I think, Leanne, that works with your comment. We've got people on the one hand, we've got governments on the other hand. We Americans tend to assume often that governments in some ways reflect what people want, and they have chosen them in some way. This is not an assumption we can make in many parts of the world, and we certainly can't make it in Russia. There is, on that person-to-person level, there's a lot of sympathy for Ukrainians, and I think that undercuts in this case the possible closeness of governments. And the Polish government has not been as close to Putin as the Hungarians have. Hungarian own little problem. The other part of the question, I'm not sure I completely captured it. So I'm going to answer something, and if that's not right, we can come back to it. I think the question is whether Putin is harming his efforts to infiltrate various Western groups, but through this action in Ukraine. And there I would have to say yes, right? That this action in Ukraine has turned Russia, the whole country, into a pariah, and in ways that I don't think that Putin anticipated. And in ways that will only play out sort of somewhere down the line, but sort of equivalent to this idea that it is harmful to the Russian opposition to have Western support. It's going to be harmful to a lot of other folks to have a suspicion of Russian support. And so in that sense,
I have a great next question for you, sliding right in there,
okay.
Like the pariah status. So do you think the US, the EU and US sanctions can actually affect Putin's actions?
So I don't hold a really high opinion of sanctions as a way to affect actions. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but at least in the short term, it's not having much of an effect. It may have more of an effect in the longer term. I've heard a lot of the justification of sanctions, particularly the sanctions against oligarchs, as being justified by, well, if these people are unhappy enough, then they will let Putin know that they're unhappy, and this will change Putin's behavior. I don't think that's true. Any of the oligarchs who continue to exist in Russia or who are still alive and not in prison have basically agreed to be Putin's lapdog. Right? So they are not in a position. They do not have the political power to force Putin to do something he doesn't choose to do. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure he's listening to anybody, but he's not listening to the oligarchs. The people who do have some control over Putin are the security apparatus. We refer to it as the Siloviki, SEAL being force. And they are not as easily targeted through sanctions. I'm sure that they have money in Western banks, and I'm sure that they like to take their vacations in the south of Spain, but they don't have as big sums, and they will not be hurt as much by losing them because they've still got networks stuck within Russia. So I don't know how responsive they are to sanctions. The thing that I think they might be responsive to is popular unrest. And that is to say, if they saw a country that they thought was falling apart, as a result of this action that Putin had taken. Then they might take action themselves. But that's a big step from where we are today. That is, we're not anywhere near that level of popular unrest. And that popular unrest is hard to accomplish in a country where the opposition has been largely destroyed.
And with a tradition where in Russian the saying is Moscow is far away, right? So it depends on where in Russia. I mean, it's such a huge country. So yeah, but I don't want to comment on too much because we have a lot more questions, and I really like our audience here today. So a big shout out to the activity level. The next question is, given your geostrategic and ideological analysis of the situation, don't you think the US should see the Ukraine as a client state of Russia and respect Russia's interests?
So that's obviously what Putin would like to accomplish. And I admit there's a logic to that. And I would also say that at the time when we were expanding NATO to encompass the former Soviet Union and to include parts of the former Soviet Union, I was not a fan. I thought, this isn't going to go well in the long run. And I think we are seeing now that it didn't really go well in the long run. We would perhaps hope that NATO membership would preclude Putin from invading certain areas, but I am less confident of that than I might have been last month. But I think having not decided to do that in the past, deciding in the present to give Ukraine over in a way that Ukraine does not choose to be given over is an admission of rather serious defeat on the part of the West. And that is to say, like, well, we can't defend you and we're not committed to it. You just go be a vassal of Russia, even if you don't want to. We could have said that earlier. I'm not sure we can say it now.
And wasn't, if I may follow up with a personal question here, wasn't there an agreement, like right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the Ukraine handed all their nuclear powers over to Russia in in exchange for the agreement that Russia would never claim Ukrainians' territory?
Right.
Yeah, and I think
so Russia is violating that.
Yeah, so I think that's an important fact to know for the status of autonomy and the self-understanding of the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and for that matter, also part of the West's geostrategic interest not to have nuclear weapons quite that close to Western Europe. So that was a win for our side, and apparently for Ukraine, although it didn't mean anything.
Right, definitely. So the next question I have is, as Putin and his retinue, despite their resources and wealth, are forced off the world stage and into a bunker lifestyle, the regime's decision making and mental health may be further questioned. Are there any checks to his unfettered access to nuclear weapons?
So that's a good question, and I'll have to say I don't know exactly. I would like to believe that the Russians do not allow a single finger to push the button, and they need to have some kind of coordination, but I am not sure that that is the case.
And then the last one I have on the screen here, the last question is, what are the prospects for peace negotiations between the Ukraine between Ukrainian and Russian delegations?
So I think a lot of that depends on the Russians, and that is to say, if the Russians can come up with a proposal that is acceptable to the Ukrainians, then I think the Ukrainians are they would like this war to end, and they obviously don't want to be completely taken over by Russians. But if the only way that Russians will stop is by Ukraine giving up its independence, I think they won't. And so in that way, if that's the demand, then there's not much of a hope for peace.
Right. Right. So we're doing great in time. We have a few more minutes if somebody wanted to add another question. Meanwhile, I still have my short list of other questions that came in, and we don't have to go all too elaborate about anything. But this one question here that was submitted was really interesting to me also personally. How ready do you think are Russians for democracy?
So that's a big question, and I'll try to do the best that I can in a short amount of time. But I think Russians are ready enough for democracy. I think Russians have a strong sense that really comes out of some of what happened during the collapse of the Soviet Union, that you're better off not getting involved in politics. And that comes also out of the Soviet Union itself. And it's reinforced by living in an autocratic regime. And so they have a tendency to draw back into private life and not pay that much attention to politics. And therefore, they don't necessarily work to defend democratic principles. But if indeed democratic principles or a democratic government was in place, I don't think they'd fight it either. They would be happy enough. As far as Russian attitudes towards democracy, they have been fairly supportive of democracy in public opinion polls and any other kinds of things like that for a long time, and going back into the late years of the Soviet Union. So they have a couple of sort of weaker spots. They don't tend to want to give rights to fascists to march in the street. But we have some of those same sorts of weaker spots of not always being tolerant of the people that we disagree with. But by and large, this principle that people should be able to hold their governments accountable, the Russians accept that. They think that's true. They haven't had the opportunity to do it. They don't have great confidence in the institutions that promise it, but they could live with it perfectly well.
That's a great answer. I was thinking that when I saw that question coming in, I felt like that might be a little bit tipping on Gorbachev and his big hope with perestroika, like after the
Right.
Collapse or initiating this actually. And many Russians will still claim we were not ready, and then that outcry, we need more, we need a heavier hand, a stronger leader, and a call for that stronger leader. But I have another question coming in here right now, and that will be the last one for today, given the time also. This is calling for your predictive powers, I guess. What's your opinion about how all this would end?
So I'm afraid that without some major change, it will end in the subjugation of Ukraine. However, I don't know that that's the end of the story, insofar as I don't think the Ukrainians will accept it, and there will be an ongoing conflict, guerrilla warfare, secret resistances, which will be hard for the Putin regime to master. We have learned from our own history, from invasion of Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Russians also learned from their invasion of Afghanistan that it can be really hard to totally subdue a region that does not choose to be subdued. And so in that sense, I don't know where the story ends, because those kinds of things have caused big regime changes. Right? The collapse of the Soviet Union is sometimes connected back to the failure of the war in Afghanistan. And so we're seeing a repeat of that kind of behavior under Putin, and the possibility of a similar kind of outcome. But that's just speculation at this point.
Yeah. That was a tough capstone for you. And with this, I think it's a great time to really thank you for this holistic coverage of a very hot topic. And thank you for engaging our audience, and thanks to the audience here today, engaging our speaker. So it works both ways, I guess. I also thank everybody here on the call to stay informed, to have a good commitment for utilizing different media sources all the time. And if you speak and utilize several languages, this is the time to actually really do that, and in order to get a picture of all sides of the story. Thank you to our speaker today. And before we conclude, I'd like to take 1 minute to announce our next Great Decisions event, which will be on March the 17th. This time it will be at 4 p.m., not around lunchtime. And the topic will be changing demographics. Our speaker will be Professor Nes Sandoval, also from SLU. So we have great SLU presence here. And then a non-Great Decisions speaker series event, but a World Affairs Council event that I would like to highlight is for the 25th of March at 6 p.m., we're actually hosting the German consul Wolfgang Mössinger here in St. Louis, and that will be a hybrid event that you can sign up for if you are interested. With all this, thank you very much again. You see the links to those events here in the chat box, as our great support team is making sure you all get this. And thank you very much, and see you all soon. Stay safe and stay tuned.